Hi, I'm Mike Hudson, Director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. Welcome to the Redux presentation of sessions from the Hidden Legacies of Helen Keller Symposium, which was held in Louisville, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The symposium, with primary sponsorship from the American Printing House for the Blind and the Filson Historical Society, brought together scholars, writers, and Keller enthusiasts from across North America. In 2020, the American Foundation for the Blind Helen Keller Archive arrived at our museum on 23 pallets. And since then, our staff has been busy cataloging, describing, measuring, and inventorying this most amazing history of one of the most amazing women of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm sitting in front of her desk from her house at Arcan Ridge. Helen Keller was a writer, activist, advocate, ambassador, and world traveler who profoundly affected the way the world thinks about people with disabilities. And yet, she is little understood, often frozen in time as a little girl with her hand under the water pump behind her parents' home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Our symposium was just a beginning effort to bring together the most current scholarship in innovative ways to better understand Keller, her companion Anne Sullivan, and her times. We hope you enjoy the series. Each session will be dedicated to a single speaker from the symposium. Our second session on Saturday morning was titled Missing Pieces, Influence and Influencers, and focused on the circle of colleagues and friends around Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. None of these tales are commonly included in biographies or legends about Keller, though the places, people, and events are known. Our third speaker in that session was writer and filmmaker Max Wallace. Wallace explored Helen Keller's visit to South Africa in 1951, where she was hosted by the Reverend Arthur Blacksall, an Anglican priest, educator of the blind, member of the International Fellowship on Reconciliation, and longtime anti-apartheid activist. Central to Wallace's story is a speech Keller gave at the Ghandi Center in Durban. Max Wallace is a New York Times best-selling author, historian, and disability advocate. His books include The American Axis, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and the Rise of the Third Reich, and Muhammad Ali's Greatest Fight, Cassius Clay versus the United States of America, and In the Name of Humanity. For more than a decade, Max has written video description for AMI TV, North America's first television network serving people with visual impairment.
Before I get into my own topic, I just want to say to compliment Lori's fascinating anecdote about the lynchings. I just recently discovered, only a couple of months ago, well into my own research, and as far as I know, this is the first time this has ever been revealed. It turns out that Helen's father, Arthur Keller, Captain Arthur Keller, Confederate captain, according to his own newspaper, Lori talked about the North Alabamian, the newspaper that he ran. Shortly after his death, the North Alabamian revealed that Arthur Keller was the first man in Alabama to take the obligations of the Klan. That's April 1868. In October 1868, in Tuscumbia. Tuscumbia is if anybody who's been to Tuscumbia knows it's a very small town. In October that year, 6 months after he's the first Klansman in Alabama, there are 3 lynchings. 3 African-American men are lynched in Tuscumbia, 6 months after he becomes the first person to take the obligations of the Klan. Joseph Lash describes Arthur Keller and his relationship to his, his black servants, or his parents were slave owners. He never inherited the enslaved workers because abolition happened before his mother died. He says that Joseph Lash was treated Negroes very kindly as long as they knew their place. So that's the official narrative. I just thought sort of an interesting anecdote to complement Laurie's anecdote. As far as Betsy's book, I highly recommend that people read her book. It's truly important. I believe that Uncle Ed, Joseph Edgar Chamberlain, is the missing link that introduces, Helen herself credits Uncle Ed with introducing her to socialism long before she met John Macy, long before she read the H.G. Wells book that she credits with her socialist epiphany. J.E. Chamberlain introduces her to socialism. And he's also, as Betsy points out, very influential in her, two decades later, she becomes the most prominent anti-war activist in the country. This seems to also stem back to Uncle Ed, so please read her book, it's very important. But now I'll talk about my own book. So I'm here to talk about Helen Keller's 1951 tour of South Africa. But before I get into that tour, I think it's important to set the historical context in her life and career and to dispel some of the myths. So when she's invited to South Africa in 1949, she's recently been outed as a communist. And she was a communist. So that sort of conflicts with the conventional narrative. Now, the conventional narrative is that she was an inspirational deaf blind girl who learned to communicate thanks to a miraculous teacher when she was 6, and then goes on to graduate from Radcliffe. But if you're at a Helen Keller Symposium, the conventional narrative is, there's countless biographies, 3 documentaries, that talks about her socialist politics. So we know she was a member of the Socialist Party. She was a suffragist. She was a co-founder of the ACLU. It's covered very well by those books. Joseph Lash starts being the definitive biographer. Talks about her socialist years. That's really the first time that's mentioned. So that socialist period is roughly between 1912 and 1924. She probably becomes a socialist around 1910. And then she goes to work for the American Foundation for the Blind in 1924. And she stops giving speeches tying disability to capitalism and extolling revolution. The fiery rhetoric is gone. Joseph Lash claims that by the time she goes to work for the AFB, her politics have mostly mellowed. She no longer sees socialism as the guiding light for mankind. She's disillusioned with the Socialist Party because they failed to oppose American intervention in World War I. And so it's a radical phase that she's gone through, and mostly she's more mature now, she's more liberal in her outlook towards society and politics. And that's a narrative that's been perpetuated by a lot of people who should know better. So, talking about the hidden legacies, there's nothing hidden about this. So, Helen goes to work for the AFB in 1924, and yes, the rhetoric mostly disappears. But 5 years later, she publishes her second memoir, Midstream, 1929. And in this book, she talks about Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. So Lenin's been dead for 5 years by this time. On the vaudeville circuit, she describes Lenin as the greatest living figure. Lenin, Edison, and Charlie Chaplin. Just before she goes to work for the AFB, she describes herself as a socialist and a Bolshevik. So she's already announced herself as a communist. Bolshevism being the name of Lenin's movement, Lenin's party in the Soviet Union. And so 1929, she talks about Lenin sowing the unshatterable seed for all mankind. This is a period when her politics had allegedly mellowed. And it's not a coincidence that the story of my life is still taught in thousands and thousands of schools, required reading, part of the curriculum, all over the world. But most people are unaware that she ever wrote a memoir about her adult life and accomplishments after Radcliffe. I don't think that's a coincidence. The Nazis certainly didn't think it was a coincidence. They tried to force her to censor the passage about Lenin. So this is 1929. 3 years later, Roosevelt is running for president. She gives an interview to the New York Times saying she's not planning to vote for Roosevelt. I think people assume that he's disabled and she has a natural affinity. She claims, I'm still a socialist, but I'm too busy with my work for the blind to deal with politics. That's 1932. And yet she's mostly giving these inspirational speeches and fundraising for the AFB. Platitudes. Other than her 1929 memoir, she's not really talking about socialism anymore. But privately, she's sending letters to Uncle Ed. She sends him a letter in the 30s talking about Russia being the great hope for all mankind. She's already written letters to her old comrades describing the Soviet Union as the promised land. In 1917, the Russian Revolution happens in November 1917. Shortly after, she writes a letter to President Wilson, claiming that this is the greatest thing that's happened for mankind in the last 2,000 years. So this is the beginning of Soviet communism, Bolshevism. For the next 30 years, she continues this theme, and Annie Sullivan dies in 1936. So between 1924 and 1936, she's been fundraising for the AFB. She's been giving inspirational speeches. And then something changes. She goes on, she takes a ship with Polly Thompson, her companion, the new Annie Sullivan, to Scotland. On the ship, she begins compiling a journal, the first journal since she was a teenager, putting down her candid thoughts. Eventually, the book gets published in 1938. The Nazis ban it because, again, it's filled with praise for the Soviet Union. She's talking about how the Nazis tried to censor her 1929 memoir. So she sort of reemerges into radical politics after 12 years, 13 years, where she mostly talks about blindness and her efforts for the blind community. Helen Keller's the original Antifa. Hitler burns her book in 1933. She's one of very few Americans whose books are burned by the Nazis in the original book burnings. And she issues a blistering attack on Nazism at that time. And then, once again, after Annie Sullivan dies, she seems to take up this anti-fascist, anti-Nazi crusade very publicly. She's writing in her journal, she's predicting that her journal, the 1938 book Journals, is probably the most important book she ever wrote. If you want to know the real Helen Keller, read those journals. She's incredibly candid and incredibly sophisticated. You get a sense of her reading habits. She speaks 5 languages plus Esperanto, the universal language, and she's reading periodicals. She's incredibly sophisticated about international politics. She's predicting that Hitler and Mussolini and Japan will wage war, which happens 3 years later, against the Soviet Union. She starts to take up the loyalist cause in Spain, right? The loyalists are battling the fascists, battling Francisco Franco, and she's she's quite obsessed with her battles against Hitler and fascism. At the same time praising the Soviet Union. For her, the Soviet Union is just an international manifestation of socialism that she's never renounced her socialism. It's just the Soviet Union is the new guiding light for mankind. In her journal, she's talking about her, how the Soviet Union is a benevolent but paternalistic regime. So she has misgivings about Stalin. She's also quite sophisticated and very knowledgeable. She's following the Moscow show trials, the purges, the kangaroo courts, the executions that Stalin's engaging in. So she doesn't like Stalin. She doesn't believe that Stalin is really a worthy successor to Lenin, her hero. But she's still glorifying Bolshevism. So this continues. And she starts to talk to the media about subjects other than blindness for the first time in more than a decade. She denounces lynching. She starts to appear at events around the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the Stalinist brigade of Americans that went off to Spain to fight fascism. And this is when the FBI first starts to pay attention to her. Her FBI file really starts here around her support of this, the loyalist cause. So this continues till 1939. Now, Joseph Lash claims that her politics have mellowed. So in 1939, it starts to become much more obvious that she's embraced the communist line. Mostly she's talked about her international support of the Soviet Union and Russia being the promised land. Now she's starting to come into the orbit of the American Communist Party. And that becomes obvious when the war starts in Europe. She spent the last 6 years, 1939, Hitler invades Poland, and she spent the last 6 years demonizing Hitler and fascism. But the American Communist Party, the International Communist Party, claim that Hitler and the Soviet Union have signed a non-aggression pact. And suddenly, communists, leftists are not allowed to criticize Hitler anymore. Both sides are equally guilty, that's the new line. Helen Keller adopts that line, lock, stock, and barrel. She's adopting the Communist Party line. She denounces Roosevelt for trying to drag America into the war. She describes it as an imperialist war, echoing the rhetoric of the Communist Party. And she writes a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt. She's been following Eleanor Roosevelt is a progressive figure. She seems to think of Eleanor Roosevelt as her political soulmate. And she sends her a gift. In 1939, she sends her 1913 book, Out of the Dark, which is a collection of her socialist essays. She says, oh, well, some of these ideas are out of date, but the spirit of revolt still remains. A year later, she writes to Eleanor Roosevelt again and tries to enlist her in her new cause. She's assumed the helm of a Spanish rescue mission to bring Spanish refugees from concentration camps in France, where they flee to France to escape Franco after Franco takes power in Spain. And then they're rounded up, stuck in Vichy, France, in concentration camps. And France agrees to release these refugees to Mexico if transportation could be arranged. So Helen assumes the helm of this rescue mission and starts to raise money to free these refugees. And she writes to Eleanor Roosevelt and invites her onto this committee. Eleanor agrees. And then shortly after, Eleanor writes back and says, I have to withdraw. I've discovered that This is a communist front. The New York Times writes about her withdrawal. Helen herself refuses to withdraw, which begins an intense pressure from the AFB, her employer, and her literary counselor, Nella Brady-Henny, who's become sort of the successor to Annie Sullivan as her protector after Annie dies. So they're conspiring with Polly Thompson to convince Helen to withdraw from this committee. Finally, after intense pressure, Helen announces her own resignation. Again, front page of the New York Times. And the narrative is that she's been duped by the communists. It's clearly a communist front. It's a Stalinist front. But Helen is too, she's disabled. She doesn't know any better. She was manipulated by these communists. Joseph Lash, 4 decades later, in his biography, in his definitive biography, Helen and Teacher, repeats this. She's been duped by the communists. Joseph Lash knows better. Joseph Lash was one of the most prominent socialist youth leaders in the United States during the 1930s. And the Soviet-Nazi pact happens in 1939, and Lash and a small minority of left-wingers recognize the hypocrisy. All of a sudden, they're not allowed to criticize Hitler anymore. Hitler, their mission is to cleanse the earth of the typhus of fascism, and suddenly they're not allowed to talk about that anymore because the Communist Party line says, no criticism of Hitler. He leaves the party. Helen adopts that line. So Helen, in a way, Lash is a little more politically sophisticated than Helen, but Helen has her own reasons. She's become a fellow traveler. She's adopted the Communist Party line, and yet Lash says she's duped. So Lash goes from being one of the most prominent socialists to a fierce anti-communist after this. He befriends Eleanor Roosevelt, and he has an affair with Eleanor Roosevelt, which is neither here nor there, but it's a juicy piece of gossip that you can discern from the FBI files. So that's that. Maybe she was duped. Except for the next 7 years, she throws herself publicly. Again, this isn't hidden. She's writing for communist newspapers and magazines. During the war, she praises Stalin as a genius. She writes a blistering attack, not quite as eloquent as the attack on segregation that Lori read earlier from her 1916 speech, but she's clearly a communist sympathizer and a fellow traveler. And mostly this is flying under the radar of the media. The FBI is paying attention. Her FBI files filled with this stuff. She starts after the war. She attends a meeting, a reception at the Soviet consulate, and she announces, finally I'm on Soviet soil. She's very excited. She starts to join communist fronts, one after another. Her best friend during this period is the prominent sculptor Joe Davidson. Joe Davidson's a concealed communist. He has his own communist front group. Helen's very active. And this is still not really attracting the attention of the media or the American public. And then McCarthy gets elected. McCarthy gets elected in November 1946, and it heralds a new era of McCarthyism, the Red Scare. Suddenly, Helen's activities, her communist activities, are starting to get more attention. And the culmination is a letter. She sends a letter to her old friend, Mother Bloor. Ella Reeve Bloor, one of the leaders of the American Communist Party, former socialist turned communist, who's probably one of the most prominent communists in America. She sends a letter, a fraternal greeting, to be printed in the program of a Philadelphia Communist Party gathering. That's a bridge too far for the FBI. And for the House Un-American Activities Committee, McCarthy's now doing his thing. And the head of the AFB tells Helen that there's a rumor that that the HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, the witch hunters, are about to investigate the foundation. This is 1947, November 1947. Shortly after, one of the most prominent anti-communist columnists in the United States, Westbrook Pegler, writes a column outing her. So she's finally outed for the first time. He talks about how she's been cited 11 times by the forerunner of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and this causes a shitstorm in the AFB. There's memos circulated back and forth about how Helen's friendship with communists and near-communists are causing a lot of trouble. A woman writes a letter saying that she's no longer contributing to the AFB because she doesn't want to fund Helen's communist activities. And this is the turning point for Helen's relationship with the AFB. Still 1947, she finally distances herself from this decade-long reemergence into radical left-wing politics. And she withdraws. Her friend Joe Davidson wants her to take a leadership role in the Progressive Party campaign of Henry Wallace, who's not a communist himself, but he's surrounded by communists. His campaign manager is a communist. The Communist Party has endorsed his campaign against Harry Truman in the 1948 presidential election for the Progressive Party of America. And Helen finally, in early 1948, she writes her friend Joe Davidson a letter backing off, saying her work for the AFB is too pressing to pay attention to politics. That's it. She becomes apolitical. She judges a Braille reading contest. She works to get the United Nations interested in the newly created United Nations interested in the welfare of the blind community. She distanced herself from these various communist front groups that she had been flirting with for years. And suddenly in 1949, there's a new director. The old director, Robert Irwin, has been there since the beginning. He helps recruit Helen to the AFB. But there's a new director, a guy named Robert Barnett, a blind Floridian, who comes in. He doesn't have that collegial relationship that his predecessor has with Helen. And he hears about her politics affecting fundraising. They're really concerned about the fundraising. Helen describes Westbrook Pegler. There's a great little anecdote from Nella's journal where she describes him as a dung beetle, which has become my favorite epithet. So Robert Irwin comes in, and he sends his assistant to try to find the Westbrook Pegler column that he's only heard about, and other political stuff. So this is the end of 1949. She doesn't realize this, and you're hearing this for the first time, but he sends a memo to his predecessor, Bob Irwin, claiming they're no longer going to use, in the last few days, we've decided not to use Helen Keller in fundraising anymore because of problems associated with her name. So she's iced out. She doesn't realize she's iced out, but she senses it. They're no longer, she was, doing fundraising, delivering speeches, appearing at events. She was their most important figurehead. Suddenly, she's being ignored, and she knows it. It's at this time that she gets an invitation to visit South Africa. The invitation comes from a guy named Arthur Blacksall, Reverend Arthur Blacksall. I think we've got a slide, the first photo, if it's there. Is there? Am I supposed to press something? I don't know what to do here. There we go. Not a very good photo. So the photo shows middle-aged white man with glasses, smoking a pipe, and wearing a clergy collar. That's Arthur Blaxall. He's a white British Anglican priest who's moved to South Africa and taken up the cause of the blind community and the deaf community, mostly the blind community. He's the chair or the president of the South African National Council for the Blind. Helen's met him already in 1931. He visits the United States, and she meets with him, and he tells her about the efforts underway in South Africa at that time for the blind community. But in 1949, things have changed. A year before she receives the invitation, the white supremacist National Party has taken power in South Africa and instituted apartheid, the formal segregation of the races. So Helen, again, very well read. Most Americans have never heard of apartheid, let alone South Africa. And she's very excited about this invitation. It's very clear. And so, again, she's been iced out by the AFB. Now, normally, her tours have been carefully stage managed. The itineraries would be planned by the AFB and its sister organization, the American Foundation for the Overseas Blind. And mostly they're be described as inspiration porn tours, right? The message is the inspirational blind girl who's overcome adversity and is a shining example of resilience. There never seemed to be any point beyond that message that had been largely unchanged since she was 6 or 7 years old. But this time it's different. The AFB's not really interested in Helen. And she's excited. She knows about apartheid, and it's very clear from the beginning, when she gets this invitation, she is on a mission. And her mission is she's very explicit about this in letters and correspondence. She wants to work for the native blind in South Africa. This is the term she uses for black South Africans, the native blind. Occasionally she calls them the colorblind. So at this point, she was already, the most important letter and the most famous letter that she ever wrote about racism and segregation was the letter that Laurie read, the 1960 letter where she supports the NAACP, causes a firestorm in the South. It causes her to backtrack because her mother's upset and her family's upset. But in the interval, she's been very outspoken about racial segregation. Not just Jim Crow, but during the war, she writes in the New Masses, a Communist Party magazine, a blistering attack against segregation, accusing the United States of hypocrisy for sending soldiers to fight for freedom overseas while black people are oppressed in the United States. So this has always been a theme. We're not exactly sure why. She's obviously from the South. She's equally passionate about anti-Semitism and discrimination in general. In fact, she gets more, it's sort of, you get the sense that when she's talking about racial segregation, she's more irate. She talks about America covering herself in shame. She's ashamed to be from the South because of segregation. She's more upset writing about racial segregation than she is about discrimination against disabled people and ableism, which is quite interesting. Although Laurie made some fascinating links. She makes those links too. This is the way she thinks. So she's determined to do something for black South Africans. So characteristically, Joseph Flash again accuses her of being duped. That's easy for people to believe that don't know Helen Keller. Helen Keller doesn't get duped into anything. She does her homework. She will not allow a high school to name Helen Keller High School, a school institution after Helen Keller, without seeing the plans, the financial statements. She always does her homework before she throws herself into any cause, and this is no exception. She starts to really throw herself into learning about the situation in South Africa. She reads Alan Paton's novel, Cry the Beloved Country, which is set just before apartheid, sort of the prelude to apartheid. She reads not one, but two books about Ghandi, his autobiography, and a book about his time in South Africa. He lives in South Africa at the beginning of the 20th century and is famously, he's thrown off the train reserved for white people, the first-class compartment, and South Africa is where Gandhi first gets the title Mahatma. Mahatma is a Sanskrit term for, I'm not sure what it means, but he's very associated with his battles against racial prejudice in South Africa are very well known. So she reads two books about that. She starts writing to people who have been to South Africa. She gets herself invited. One of her close friends is the editor of the Amsterdam News, Haarlem's probably America's largest black newspaper. He's a very influential figure in the African American community, and he's a friend of hers. They socialize. He's invited to intimate dinner parties, so they're actually friends. She contacts him. He invites her to the Harlem cotillion, the debutante's cotillion, like a ball, where black teenage girls come out in society. And she attends. It's very clear the reason she's attending this ball is because the guest of honor is Ralph Bunche. Ralph Bunche is the first black Nobel laureate. A year earlier, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He's a diplomat and a civil rights activist. And he's traveled extensively in South Africa. She already knows him. She's described him. She visited him at the UN a year earlier. She describes him as her hero. He describes her as his greatest inspiration, so they have a mutual admiration society. She goes to the ball in Harlem, and she talks to Ralph Bunche. He briefs her about the situation in South Africa since apartheid, and he tells her, this really sticks with her, he tells her that the condition of the workers, South Africa is known for its mines, its gold mines, and he talks about how their conditions are 100 years before Britain implemented the industrial reform legislation in 1832, South Africa is 100 years behind that. So untold misery for black workers. This is what sticks with her. So she finally, a year later, meanwhile, the Blacksall is kind of an interesting figure. He works for the blind community, he works for the deaf community, and yet, at first, I thought he was just a do-gooder missionary who's, working for disabled people out of Christian obligation. Then I find a notation in his yearbook, in his high school yearbook, that talks about how in England he had been rejected from the British Army in the First World War because of visual impairment. So he does seem to have some sort of identification with the blind community. And so she finally arrives in South Africa in February 1951. And at first, this is a 2.5-month tour, by far the longest that she's ever gone on tour anywhere. And so she arrives, and she's trotted around. She has multiple engagements. She starts to write letters to her friends, confiding her real. This is how you always know what Helen's really thinking. So she's telling the newspapers, she's very, very famous. Can't underscore how famous she is all over the world. The story of my life's been translated into 50 languages by this point. And so she's telling newspaper reporters who follow her everywhere she goes how much she loves South Africa, how it's such a wonderful country. Meanwhile, she's sending letters to friends about how much she hates South Africa, mostly because of racial prejudice. So one of the problems is that because of apartheid, she's been forced there's an itinerary, this massive itinerary, because she has to speak separately to white Black, Indian, and colored audiences. Colored is a mixed race, but also Malay, Pakistani, Muslim. So instead of just the usual 5 or 6 appearances, she's got 25 appearances on her itinerary, plus countless dignitaries want to meet her everywhere she goes. She's 70 years old at this point. It's quite exhausting. She arrives in Johannesburg, and again, she tells the newspapers how much she's enjoying her visit. She writes Joe Davidson, her best friend at this point, about how she hates Johannesburg because of it's an ugly city. It has gold fever, and it's bitter racialism, she describes it. So she's very conscious of the racism everywhere she goes in South Africa, and especially the fact that she's forced to speak to segregated audiences. So on this visit, she's invited to meet with, she's invited for a tour of the big mine in Kimberley, South Africa, the biggest open mine pit in the world. It's called the Big Hole. So she's invited on a tour, and then she gets to feel diamonds, like these massive diamonds that have been extracted from the big mine. And she gets invited by the head of De Beers, Oppenheimer, who owns the big mine, who's the biggest gold mining magnate in the world. She's invited to tea with Oppenheimer and his wife, Lady Oppenheimer, and she's writing Joe Davidson about this visit. And she said, oh, we had a lovely visit. They treated me with great hospitality. This is one of those incidents where I had to hold my mutinous tongue. Okay, so this is a theme. This, between 1912 and 1924, she's calling John D. Rockefeller a monster of capitalism, and saying that a monument should be erected called the Shame of America after the Ludlow Massacre, where thugs working for his company gunned down a whole bunch of workers and children. And then, 4 decades later, she has to hold her mutinous tongue. So she's very well aware. She believes, she's been told, she actually consulted on her way. She wrote a letter to John Wilson, head of the Royal Council for the Blind in England, who had also traveled extensively in Africa, who tells her, you should avoid racial controversy. When I was in East Africa, I criticized racial segregation there. This wasn't South Africa. This was just regular colonialist segregation or discrimination. And it had terrible consequences. The blacks were embarrassed. The whites were appalled. And so he said, don't start racial controversy, but be frank about it if somebody raises it. So she holds her mutinous tongue, and she tells the newspapers how much she's enjoying her visit. And then, one day, she gets to Cape Town. Wait, let's see. How do I do this? Yeah, so she arrives in Cape Town. And as usual, reporters want to know how she feels. And this time, this is March 1951. She's been in the country a few weeks. She tells the reporter that she's appalled and saddened by the discrimination. The newspaper headline here says, Miss Helen Keller is saddened. And she said, I've been very impressed with work being done for the blind and the deaf, but how much more needs doing? One thing had saddened her a great deal, that non-Europeans are always segregated from Europeans. The Afrikaners, the white South Africans who controlled the country, had justified apartheid by saying God sanctioned it. The Dutch Reformed Church supports apartheid. This is dictated in the Bible. She says, it hurts me indeed to see one group serve first and the other waiting in darkness and silence. God was never for any special group among the fortunate. And she had been appalled to learn that in some areas of native reserves, black townships, where the incidence of blindness was as high as 1 in 7 or 8 people, there were hardly any facilities for helping or training them. So this is unusual. She had been told to avoid racial controversy. She had consulted a wide range of experts, including her friend Ralph Bunche, a diplomat, about how to avoid these things. When she does something like this, when she suddenly criticizes apartheid for the first time, quite explicitly, this isn't an accident. This is Helen Keller. She's very sophisticated. The closest parallel that I'd find that I can compare her to is Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton is famous for, she gave an interview saying she supported gay marriage long before gay marriage was legalized. And then there was a backlash among her base. And then she dialed it back. And then recently she said, oh, Black Lives Matter. And again, there's a backlash, and then she comes out and says, oh, well, all lives matter. When Dolly Parton does this, it's not an accident, right? There's a wink and a nod to progressives, because she's progressive, but to her base, like, oh, all lives matter. This is Helen Keller, but Helen doesn't apologize. She just moves on. It's just unusual. So we don't know how it's perceived at this point. There's just one article. It's the last time she ever explicitly criticizes segregation during her entire 2.5 months.
Mr. Wallace, you have to wrap it up.
Okay. So she alludes to her disapproval of apartheid. She arrives in Durban. Durban is where the Indian community lives. It's where Ghandi settled in the beginning of the 20th century. He lived in South Africa for years. It's the Indian community. She arrives in Durban, and she's invited to Gandhi Memorial Hall to speak in front of 3,000 Indian people. And she's told that Manilal Gandhi, Gandhi himself, Mahatma Gandhi, had been assassinated 3 years earlier in India. Manilal Gandhi is his second son, and he is staging a hunger strike, a fast, to protest apartheid. So she speaks to 3,000 Indians, and she's informed that Manilal Gandhi's family is in the audience, two of his children. And she pauses midway through her speech, and she says, I want to send a message to your family, whose your father is one of my heroes, and so Manilal Gandhi's oldest daughter rushes forward out of the audience and embraces her and says, Sita Gandhi says, I'm going to bring your message back to my father. Her father's not there because he's back in Phoenix settlement on his hunger strike. So this is where I come in. I'm trying to, it's 70 years ago. Hardly anybody's alive that ever met Helen Keller, but I seek out 2 of Gandhi's grandchildren who were there. Ella Gandhi, who was 11 at the time, I interviewed her recently. She told me she remembers it as if it was yesterday. She was only 11, so she didn't really understand the politics, but she knew how famous this person was. Her brother, Arun Gandhi, still alive, wasn't there. He was running the newspaper in his father's absence. But Helen is invited with Polly back to meet the parents later on that afternoon for tea. So both of them are there. They remember her criticizing apartheid passionately to her parents. And they talk about Arun, who was 17 at the time, still alive, told me that her criticism of apartheid had preceded her appearance. It was widespread. He said she annoyed the regime to no end, but there was nothing they could do without creating a scandal. So, they could have deported her, but they couldn't do it. She's too beloved a figure. And Ella tells me that the thing that really strikes me is this is 1951. Jim Crow, she's from Alabama. South Africa's not that much different than Alabama at this time. So why is she so upset throughout her tour by what she's saying? So Ella, who becomes a very prominent ANC MP later on and very close to Nelson Mandela, tells me she believes the major difference is that in South Africa, a tiny white minority dominated a large black majority. as opposed to Alabama, where African Americans were in the minority. She said that would have been the primary difference between South Africa and Jim Crow at the time, which is quite fascinating. So anyway, she finally goes back to America.
That would actually be a good point to stop, because
I'll just wrap up in 30 seconds.
we're running
Okay.
into the lunch hour now. We're
Okay,
5 minutes.
let me just, 30 seconds, wrap up. 5 years later, Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress, and 151 dissidents are rounded up by the apartheid regime. Helen Keller, they're put on trial for treason under the Suppression of Communism Act, and they face the death penalty. Nobody has ever heard of Nelson Mandela at this point. Helen Keller writes a letter where she talks about to raise money for Nelson Mandela, the defense fund. Oh, sorry, this is a black audience surrounding Helen on stage. So she, in a treason trial bulletin in South Africa, she writes, freedom-loving, law-abiding men and women should unite throughout the world to uphold those who denied their rights to advancement and education, and never cease until lands are purged from the poison of racism and oppression. So this is left with her entire life. In 1960, she condemns the Sharpeville massacre. So this trip represents a very strong turning point in her career. And I will wrap up there.